in some ways, blockchains are already modular. We rely on the networking bandwidth of, the internet connections and fibers underneath that we don't all have expertise in. And so I think we just see this continuing to expand, and as we want to go into more demographics and have more useful applications for people, the reality is that the people building web applications and front ends don't have the capacity to be able to understand, baseline cryptography necessarily always. So if we want to be able to have a large amount of builders and a large amount of space, we need to break up into this kind of more specialized route. And that's where modular is going.
None of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice or an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by WAGMI Ventures or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Hey WAGMI family, Benga here with another WAGMI Ventures podcast episode. We've recently had some guests on to share on the evolving modular blockchain ecosystem and wanted to explore this space further. We have on the show today Jordan Oroshiba. Jordan's the CTO and co-founder of Astria, a modular blockchain that allows individuals to deploy their own censorship-resistant rollup without relying on a centralized sequencer. For anyone who is new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast where we do snapshots with interesting builders and founders across crypto and AI. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. All right, then, let's enjoy our chat with Jordan. Hey, man, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Nice. Yeah, I'm going to start with you sharing your crypto journey with us. How did this all start?
Yeah, I guess like many of us, the crypto journey started around 2010. Like all too many people, played around with Bitcoin, lost a hard drive at some point in time to long since gone. We could have retired and somewhere in a landfill there's a hard drive with some oodles of money. But my crypto journey really paused at that point. I have a big tech background after going to college and doing all those sorts of things. It was 2020 that I really fully jumped into crypto. Previously worked at Google and Facebook, done some things related to privacy and dev tooling at both places, and just kind of disenchanted with the large company space. I first started dipping in. I think at the time there was a lot of hoopla around crypto is going to change the world and fix everything. And having worked with a lot of big tech and big data operation, dubious, but started digging into some of the things that were happening kind of silently in the background. And as I kind of ultimately decided to leave that and try to do something different, crypto kind of just kept pulling me interested in it as a financial rails technology, as well as coming from that dev and privacy background. I was interested in how can we make this a technology which you integrate into normal everyday apps. And that's where scalability really comes to the forefront, because working at places like Google and Facebook, you just see the broad amount of data which is actually being processed every day. We have an Ethereum blockchain today where an archive node, I think, is somewhere around 14 to 15 terabytes of data. This is the sort of data that some of these teams at Google are processing every hour, right? So it's, what are we actually going to do to build true scalability and to bring applications of use to the masses? And so as I started to come in, was really interested in the roll-up space and whatnot. And it's kind of how I ended up working on Astria, was, digging into, reaching out to my co-founder who I knew from working at Google, and digging into Select quite a bit, and kind of the way that they had this approach to go about the data availability problem, using data availability sampling and actually kind of changing the scaling curve of what we're doing with the amount of data that processes. By, in giant Web 2 companies, you have a database, you have two options. You can either make the box bigger or you can shard and distribute it. And so it was okay, how are we going to actually solve scaling? You can either scale vertically or horizontally. We have this goal, and we're doing blockchain to make it such that lots of people can run nodes. Ethereum has this, to an extent, I think sometimes overzealous view of everyone should be able to run it on a Raspberry Pi. And then you have the opposite end that Ethereum sometimes goes in as well, which is, we see this with some of the work that's being done to use TEEs and whatnot, where it's specialized hardware you actually need to run something. It's okay, how do we find the middle ground and make it such that these can be scalable technologies that are free of government interference, by and large, by the nature of, you just have a large mass of people that are running things, but also can have this scalability to do things that are actually useful. And weird dichotomy there. And that's where I came in. Astria is actually the first project I worked on in crypto, but coming from that background in big tech.
And thanks for sharing that, especially you're coming from Google and sort of seeing how technology can scale really fast and how you can transfer a lot of that concept or fundamental concept to how things are done in building infrastructure for Web3. Just to frame, there's a lot you shared there, and just to frame today's conversation, and before we deep dive into the details of Astria, let's talk a little bit with maybe some background on the modular ecosystem, and then kind of talk through maybe some technical terms around data availability, sequencing, rollups, and the decentralized network. That would help our audience just sort of like carry along before we dive into your project.
Yeah, I think when we talk about the modular ecosystem and kind of where it comes from, it's similar to how a lot of technologies outside of crypto have evolved, right? We started with when I first started doing web development, we were running Apache servers and whatnot. And it's like, okay, what do you do? It's like, oh, you have a database and you run Postgres, and that scales to a certain extent. And we went through this thing in the Web 2 space where people were saying, well, we have like MongoDB come along, which says it's shardable and distributable, and that makes it easier for you to scale. And people be like, oh, well, you want to use this because it handles, there's a whole meme video, like MongoDB is a web scale. Funny video from back in the day. But you have this idea that as you grow into a larger organization, into a larger, just like when you are trying to accomplish more things, you split into specializations, right? So what was a singular application that handles user authentication, and all of this turns into there's a user service, and you have this kind of microservice architecture that comes about. And from an economic standpoint, it makes a lot of sense in terms of a specialization, right? Like the person who is an expert in making coffee isn't an expert in growing coffee beans. And so as we grow to be able to do more things with crypto, the modular ecosystem grows out in such a way that we have unique specializations of what we're doing. What Celestia is doing with data availability, they focus on how can we make that, and they're experts on how can we continue to grow the block space and make it such that there is a thorough bandwidth of data availability available to us. In some ways, blockchains are already modular. We rely on the networking bandwidth of the internet connections and fibers underneath that we don't all have expertise in. And so I think we just see this continuing to expand as we want to go into more demographics and have more useful applications for people. The reality is that the people building web applications and front ends don't have the capacity to be able to understand baseline cryptography necessarily always. So if we want to be able to have a large amount of builders and a large amount of space, we need to break up into this kind of more specialized route. And that's where modular is going. We have people who are building apps, and not everyone necessarily has to be a full-on protocol dev, but your team might have some people who do protocol. It's about having nice specializations and encapsulation, and making sure that we have clean abstractions for people to be able to integrate with without having to understand how everything works exactly under the hood.
Right. And that's very helpful. And that transition from, the monolith to bringing in more specialization in how the modular ecosystem views transaction segregation of each of those pieces is kind of how this ecosystem like continues to evolve, and what's really in the core driver of it, right? And as I think of Astria, what is the value prop there? What is differentiating it in how the modular ecosystem evolves?
Yeah, I think in talking about where Astria fits in, it's easiest to talk about where Astria came from. And so Josh was working at Celestia when Astria was started, and initially we had this project, and it was based off of a blog post written about this idea of Sevmos, which was how do we provide a settlement layer on top of this widely available DA? And the idea was you do a Cosmos chain built using Ethermint, and you post data to Celestia. As we were looking at this and starting to build this, what we realized as we were building it, there's two reasons to kind of have this level of abstraction. One is that like not everyone needs to understand how do you post your data to the underlying data availability layer. And we also want to make it easier for people to build applications on top of those. as we were building out this initial chain, we had this kind of, we're like always in the back of our mind was, how do we actually decentralize this? Because when we look at the L2s today, they are all currently centralized in some way, shape, or form. And especially we traditionally a shared sequencer, or we started referring to it as kind of a sequencing layer. I think we can almost think of it as like building an application platform, which is how do we make it such that people can use broadly available data availability without them having to know that it's happening, being able to rely on a decentralized service to build their application on top of. And how do we do that in such a way where there's so many people who will come and they'll look at the EVM and they'll say like, well, this isn't really ideal. And so there's always people coming up with new ways to build some sort of a virtual machine on top of things, whether or not that's continued growth of the EVM that we see Arbitrum has done with introducing Stylus, or we see wherever Fuel is with doing things with their new VM option, or, we even have the people starting to do Bitcoin rollups, and we have people doing all sorts of different execution environments, COSM, WASM, and all of these. And it was like, okay, all of these applications need a way in order to decentralize. And so our initial idea was like, okay, we're going to make something that can allow you to run EVM rollups, but it was how can we make that such that that's more differentiated and such that we can support EVM rollups, but we can also support things that are doing anything else. And that's kind of where the shared sequencing kind of aspect came out of. I think shared sequencing was kind of a unfortunate nomer. It's really just how do we build a decentralized layer, can provide sequencing and provide this like utility to people. The other aspect as we thought about it was, okay, we are trying to make it such that people can have, how many rollups do we see us happening? Right now we have 5 or 6 main ones, but if we talk about having an actual rollup app future with as the future of scalability of blockchains, and we talk about having applications that do all sorts of different things. And even if you have an application that's just payments, like, okay, there's going to be some competitors in terms of payments. And how do we make it such that all of these things can come up? And it's like, is everyone who comes up going to be able to recruit their own decentralized network set? There becomes a limit to the ability for us to innovate if everyone is hamstrung by having to come up with new validators. So having a shared platform where, again, I come from Web 2, so I go back to kind of Web 2 similarities here. It's how do we have a platform that makes it easy for you to launch? And this is what cloud computing did for a lot of Web 2 companies, whether that was like Cloud Functions or Google Apps Scripts or whatever this is. Or you used Heroku, right? You were like, okay, well, I can build my application, and then when I need to find a place to launch it, there's someone else who has that expertise. So it's like, how can we provide the platform such that when people want to build a rollup, they want to post data on chain in order to have a decentralized data ledger, that we can make it super easy for that. And so that's where Astria, I think, comes in. I view it kind of as this like rollup platform, and providing the tooling which makes it easier for you to get on board, make your app be successful, make your rollup be successful, and to provide kind of an ecosystem around that.
Gotcha. What does the target market for decentralized sequencers look like? What's the potential value accrual in a world where you have multiple rollups tapping into this same shared sequencer?
Yeah, I think the value accrual here is going to ultimately depend on the types of apps we see over the long term and the way in which those apps decide to work. You could see in some sense, and this is a little bit, I think we tend to be very hypothetical here, and that there's a reality that we're going to have to launch some things and see where the value goes. My opinion is that value always tends to go to the application. Some of that, at the end of the day, if we have applications which users are actually using, that's where the stickiness is. It's not necessarily with the database they're using or the underlying like data availability layer that they're using. However, blockchains are a little bit different in that there's always been in application development some stickiness to choosing how you're storing your data because there's high data costs. That one of my favorite things to tell people about data centers is that the fastest data bandwidth available in the world is a truck filled with hard drives. You can't actually, this is how data centers tend to actually migrate data, like load the tapes and put them on a truck, because you can't move the data faster than you can in a truck in that manner. It's very low latency, but very high bandwidth. And so when you have large amounts of data, and especially when it's on-chain data, there's not necessarily a clean migration pathway. So there are ways in which you can do migrations, and we see this with people using weak subjectivity windows and whatnot in terms of how you move and migrate. But you have a little bit more stickiness just because everything is in order. It's already has timestamps. It's already that. And that's a lot of what blockchains actually, in my view, from like a highly technical level, like when we talk about decentralizing, we are oftentimes talking about a shared view of what time is, but that's kind of a tangent that I could go down. So in terms of where value accrues, I think if we have sticky applications, at the end of the day, the applications are the drivers of that. I think we're working on ways that we can do things like application specific sequencing, where you can have, and this is kind of when we talk about what the limitations of using a decentralized sequencer are, is that at the end of the day, the person running the rollup has the choice. There's optionalities here in terms of, you could say that half of my block space, I have a censorship resistant pathway, which uses its decentralized network, but the top of my block comes through my centralized relayer, and high value transactions are flowing through that. Ultimately, you have gas fees on your rollup, and you have ways that your application has revenue, and there is a fee paid for posting data into a database. And it's, again, I'm a Web 2 person initially, but there's a lot of similarities here in terms of it's a database and a service. And the difference is, instead of that funding necessarily going to a specific company, that goes into a network and an ecosystem.
Hey everybody, quick thing here. We're excited to announce WAGMI Advisory, your home for all things fundraising, hiring, and partnerships. This is all about supercharging your project with the WAGMI network, consisting of over 20,000 executives, investors, and builders in crypto, all ready to come alongside your project to help it succeed. Get in touch at team@wagmiventures.io to learn more and figure out if WAGMI Advisory is the right fit for your project. Let's get back to the show. And thank you for helping to unpack what value accrual looks like. And I guess the audience is the developer piece, or the developers, I should say. And it's been early days for Astria, but what has feedback from the developer crowd been like since you have launched?
Yeah, I mean, and so there's two aspects here. One is that we haven't gone through to our full mainnet launch. We have had a testnet live for a little bit now. We've had many iterations of DevNet. The way that we have chosen to integrate with developers is probably a little bit different than a lot of other folks. One of those is that we do a lot of in-house dog fooding of our own work. And then we work with select few partners in terms of how we work and integrate with developers. This is just to have a closer partnership with folks and to be able to get the best feedback we can. In general, the feedback has been very positive. This is kind of my background as well. Is like, how do we make this developer tooling as easy as possible? So we have some good tooling. There's obviously, it's not all perfect out of the gates. One of the things we have within our product and space is that we have quite a bit of breadth of what we're doing with a relatively small team. So we have some things that we're working on polishing and getting into a better state. But I think the overall feedback we've gotten is that it's very easy for people to focus on their application and not have to worry about how everything works under the hood. Have Formug, who we've been working with, who has had essentially no issues with our underlying infrastructure. I think we had a couple of high demand instances where it was like, okay, we can go and work on helping them manage through these, but it's been easy for them to develop and iterate on top of things. And that's really our goal, is to make it as easy for you to forget that we exist as possible.
Yep, makes sense. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about you're sort of born out of your relationship with Celestia and have been sort of building very closely in conjunction with the Celestia team and ecosystem. Are there any plans to build on other data availability chains outside of Celestia? I mean, what is the roadmap looking like?
Yeah, at the moment, there's no specific plans to build on anything outside of Celestia. The key for us here is that Celestia is live on mainnet and has data availability sampling, which from a technical perspective provides some of this increased bandwidth. We now have EIP 4844, which is live. A big part of this is that I see offering data across multiple data availability layers, at least at the current stage, as fracturing the sustainability of every rollup within the ecosystem. And so we talk about one of the things that we are working on are ways in which you can have interoperability between rollups. And when you have your ultimate source of like data finality and certainty that everyone can arrive to that same source of truth over time, fractured across different ecosystems, it can, even though we have Astria as kind of we say it's an L1 with the data is posted to alternative layers, even though we provide that, we rely on for that like final full ability for everyone to reach that same truth. We do post the data and utilize that to provide better guarantees. if those guarantees are different depending on which rollup you use, it can be more difficult to have interop. That said, nothing in our architecture is actually like super finely tied to using Celestia. We have a component which does data posting, but our core protocol doesn't have anything specific to Celestia ingrained in it. And so there's nothing stopping us from either posting to multiple networks such that you have the optionality to gain interop with other networks. We could post data to blob storage on Ethereum or some other data availability network, which comes up in addition to Celestia, or have a option of you post data to some parts to one and some parts to another. But the view for me is that it's best to have at least one where everything gets posted because it guarantees some degree of interop there. And there's just other functionality in terms of the roadmap that I think is more important in the immediate future.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch on one of that, but it does sound like your approach to how you're building the architecture and even the code base is very open source today, right?
Yes.
Makes sense.
So,
And then, I'm
something
sorry, go
like
ahead.
99% of our code here is open source. Anything that we don't have that's entirely open source right now today is entirely about internal infrastructure management and just how we're managing Kubernetes clusters and whatnot.
Gotcha. Yeah. And on the point about roadmap, I know you're like doing some exciting work on I think what you currently term Astra EVM, which sounds really intriguing. Like, what is the status of that and how does it fit into the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that we have here. First of all, we have what we have kind of outwardly called Astra EVM, which is we're now calling Flame. And so we're building Flame to be a Celestia DeFi, like the Celestia native DeFi hub built on top of Astria. What that is built on top of is also from like a technical standpoint, a Astria Geth client, which makes it really easy for people to deploy any EVM rollup on top of it. Forma also is operating that they have a fork of this. It's made to make it easy for you to add your own precompiles and do kind of unique to your rollup applications within it. But again, making it just as easy as possible for people to use technology which they're already familiar with. It's pretty minimal. It's in some ways similar to the way that Optimism has OP Geth, and that it's a system in which if you are familiar with Geth, which a lot of people do, you can create the modifications needed for your own rollup. We built that to dog food as we're building this sequencer. It's like, okay, well, a sequencer that's not sequencing anything. It's like, okay, let's build this. And that's kind of the same with Flame here, where Flame as this DeFi ecosystem for DeFi within the Celestia ecosystem, we view ourselves as being able to kind of bootstrap this Celestia ecosystem as a place of fast innovation, and having DeFi native to that space as a source of bringing in liquidity and making it so people can actually do things within that Celestia ecosystem is important to future rollups that are coming on board.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. I think the DeFi piece obviously is one of the strong components of where we see things from a narrative point of view going today. One of the pieces that sort of helps DeFi grow is interconnectedness and interoperability. And so I'm just thinking about bridging here, right? And how bridging happens on an Astria or Astria EVM or Flame as it is known today. So, what does bridging on it look like? Is it similar to Optimism's approach or is it different?
So there's two components to this. First of all, that Ash is kind of the base layer for these rollups is IBC connected. And so you have access, bringing into that Astria ecosystem, you have access to any IBC sort of related bridge. We have a pathway similar to the way that IBC works in which you can do a one hop. So it'll be possible for you to take your Celestia from Celestia itself and do a kind of, IBC has this idea of and actually Celestia just implemented this recently with their new lemongrass upgrade, but you have the ability to do kind of one hop through. And so you can do this kind of where it's okay, you transfer to Astria, but it's actually into Flame itself. And it goes through and it gets unwrapped in Astria and then it immediately gets pushed to the rollup. So from Celestia, you'll be able to bridge directly into Flame with Tia to participate in that network. And we're working on connections with other members of the IBC ecosystem, such as we're going to work with the Noble folks to make sure that there's USDC and other pieces on top of there. In terms of how similar the bridging then is within rollups to Optimism, I think from the get go it's a somewhat similar approach. we have a kind of Astria core bridge protocol. The mechanism here today is fairly rudimentary in that there is a per rollup. The idea is that a rollup owns its own bridge. And so I think this is also very similar to the way that Optimism and OP rollups work today, is that you have the trusted bridge that exists there. There's no reason that with your EVM, you can't bridge in through other means either. If you're running an EVM, you can you can use other EVM bridge options. And this is actually also similar to Optimism. Not everyone who bridges into Optimism uses the native bridge. You might use some option of a third party bridge, which has like a smart contract based bridge, which comes in from other ecosystems. But yeah, we have this kind of trusted bridge. One of the differences, I guess, for us here is that because our sequencer state machine is agnostic to the EVM or whatever that's running on top of it, it doesn't have enshrined information about the state on it itself, that they have ownership over their own state. We don't do the fraud proof type mechanism. To an extent, it's a multi-sig trusted bridge, which is the reality for the systems, which I know Optimism just enabled fraud proofs, but is the reality for the bridges today. The long term here is certainly trending towards what do we think about doing kind of ZK properties and whatnot within here, such that we can enable this so that it's not tied to any specific VM. But for right now, the bridge is roll up owned. And when you bridge out, you do trust the entity which owns that bridging. And we're working on kind of the grieving mechanisms there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't know how much of that you can share with us, but it'd be nice to know what exciting features you guys are thinking of launching as you sort of move towards mainnet. What should we be looking forward to?
Yeah, I think the exciting thing that we're thinking about here in the short term really is this kind of application specific sequencing. And so Flame in particular, we're working on kind of a two paths in which you can submit transactions through. One, kind of the idea here is that there's similar, and this will evolve over time into a full PBS system that's hopefully more generic. But for the moment, it allows the application itself to capture some value that's going through in terms of what's happening at the top of its block. Or, you could alter the way it works, but our view here is that we're going to have two pathways. One is kind of for the top transaction in a given block, especially in DeFi ecosystems. This can result in things like PGAs and whatnot if you don't have a mechanism for dealing with it. But we're going to have the rest of the block where if you're not interested necessarily in participating in this bidding war for the top transaction, that there's an easy pathway for everyday users to access, but people who are participating in this top of block auction, and that can actually benefit the protocol itself in terms of going back into the protocol, as opposed to potentially creating spam and stopping everyday users from being able to get in as well.
Definitely exciting and be looking forward to it. Obviously staying close, and I'll switch gears one last time here to ask what else in crypto you find fascinating outside of rollups and sequencers.
Yeah, I think in general, and this kind of fits in with the Astria ethos, is I love experimenting and being able to build and ship things quickly. One of the things that to the point of trying to make it easier for people to build new applications is anything that people are doing that's really unique. I think we have a number of spaces, and as we're building an ecosystem, we will be guilty of going through and being okay, we're doing stuff that other ecosystems have as you build the baseline of it. But I'm really excited for all the things that people are doing that are just out of the box and out of left field, and just trying to see what can fit, whether that's coming up with new ways of new virtual machines, or it's new messenger apps or new paradigms. And a lot of these are going to fail. And I think, but some of these are going to be successful. And that's, I think, what really excites me. And what our goal is at Astria is to make it easier for people to do innovation at that user layer, and to be able to ship things and find out what works and what doesn't and pivot. The crypto market, especially in a VC space, I think it goes through these ebbs and flows. And part of that is because going to market is such a large step for companies in the space. You have to build an entire protocol and then build an application and try and build users. Whereas if you look at but before I did all the big tech stuff, I worked at a number of small startups, and oftentimes these small Web2 startups get a seed fund of 500K, whereas in crypto, it's like a $10 million seed round. But that's because 500K in a seed round in Web2 is enough for you to potentially get an application out the door, which can start generating revenue. And so how can we make it such that you can have 2 people in a garage as opposed to 6 people in 2 years? What if we have it make it such that 2 people can work for 2 months and bring an app out and then and find their product market fit, as opposed to having to have a whole team in 2 years to build a whole new protocol? That's really what excites me. And I think some of these new rollups that are coming out, even on top of other platforms, are really cool. I think I was in New York and they have like the Blackbird stuff it's all over there. That's really exciting. But yeah, that's kind of what excites me in the crypto world.
Hey everybody,
Yeah,
thanks
that's
for
awesome.
listening.
And
If you enjoyed the
congrats on
episode,
your
go ahead and give us a good
$1.5
5-star
million
rating
round, which is
and subscribe
pretty
wherever you're getting your
big
podcasts so you can get
round
all the latest
so
conversations
looking forward
from the
to
most
all the
interesting
great things that come
founders,
out of that.
builders, and
Thank you
investors
for
from
being on the
across the
show
world.
and for educating
Thanks so much
us on
and have a good one.
development and growth of your modular ecosystem. Good luck with Astria, and talk again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much.